these slaves or indentured servants who, are either paying off a debt and belong to the households of the Awilim, of these free men. And so for that reason, this lex talionis, this eye for an eye, applies equally across classes. So if an Awilim takes out the eye of another Awilim, then the punishment is that his eye shall be taken out. However, if an Awilim takes out the eye of another man's slave, he doesn't have his eye taken out, he just pays a set fee. So there's a sliding scale of justice. We see laws regulating things such as divorce and alimony, child support even. If a man wishes to separate from a woman who has borne him children, he shall give her back her dowry and part of the field and garden and property so she can rear her children. She may then be free to remarry the man of her heart. However, if a woman wishes to leave this man and plunges him into debt and tries to ruin his house and is convicted by the court, he has the choice of either releasing her or she shall be cast into the river. So not exactly equality between the sexes. This is a patriarchal system, but there are rights enshrined protecting, say, women and protecting them from just being abandoned by their husbands, ensuring them alimony rights, these sorts of things. We also see an emphasis on the organs of government, right? The system of laws. If you bear false witness against somebody, the punishment is pretty severe. If anybody brings a capital charge before the elders and cannot prove it, he shall be put to death. So if you walk into a court and say, my wife was ravaged by this man, and you can't prove it, and you're making false accusation, then you yourself will be culpable for the charge that you're bringing forth. Same thing applies to judges. If judges try cases and later error appears of their own fault, then they're supposed to pay 12 times the fine that they set. They're publicly ridiculed, and they never again can render judgment. So the set of laws, we're seeing issues of culpability, insurance, malpractice, corruption, alimony, child support, perjury, very modern concepts. These problems that people encounter, and some of these are incredibly complicated. Answering these questions of what if a man comes back from battle and he was thought to be dead, and his wife has remarried somebody else, and now she has kids with him, so who gets what? And these laws actually break down who gets what and how the situation should be dealt with. In some cases, again, quite severely. As great as these laws are, and as severe as they are, we don't have a lot of evidence that they were actually carried out in actual legal tablets, and we have over 100 examples of Babylonian legal tablets. The code, or the Code of Hammurabi, is referenced only once. So it doesn't seem as though these were fixed laws that were set in place, and there was probably quite a bit of flexibility in dealing with actual court cases. So these things are not mandatory sentencing. You're not looking at, again, this sort of black and white, if you did this, then this is going to happen. But this monument is important for the reason that, again, this is Hammurabi presenting himself as a ruler, as a lawgiver to the people. In fact, the prologue establishes not just Hammurabi as a king, but also the importance of Babylon, and invokes the gods as well. I'm going to read it to you. The prologue states, "When Anu the sublime, king of the Anunnaki, and Bel, the Lord of the heavens and earth, decreed the fate of the land, assigned to Marduk, the ruling god, god of righteousness, dominion of earthly man, and made him great among the council. They called Babylon by his illustrious name, and made it great on earth, founding an everlasting kingdom in it, a kingdom whose foundations are as strong as heaven and earth." And again, right, remember, Babylon, up until this point, hasn't been important. So now, right, this is sort of saying, this is the foundation of Babylon, why it's important. And who rules Babylon? Continues. The king, Anu and Bel, called Hammurabi by name, the exalted prince who feared God, to bring forth rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that he should rule over the black-headed people like Shamash, and enlighten the land and further the well-being of mankind. So in a lot of ways, the stele is less justice and more justification, propping Hammurabi up and establishing him as a secular king, but a king who fears the gods and brings justice from the gods. And we don't see that actually perfectly in the imagery that accompanies this text. In the upper scene, we see Hammurabi before the god Shamash, receiving the rod and ring from him. And Shamash is an interesting god. He's the city god of Babylon. And as Babylon becomes important, Shamash becomes important. He's a native Mesopotamian god, but he was adopted by Hammurabi and these Amorite elite. He's a sun god, and he's associated with justice. And he fits into a set of triads here that sort of encompass all the elemental aspects of earth. Shamash, in association with Ishtar and Nana, represent, right, we've got the sun, which is Shamash, Nana or Sin, we've got the moon, and then Ishtar, right, this fertile element that makes it possible. Fertility, warfare, love, the fertility of the earth. These three work together in conjunction. At the same time, there's another triad that we've seen a little bit earlier. Anu, our sky god, Enlil, a storm god, and then Enki, who fulfills the same role as Inanna, in this case, a god of the earth, of fertility and production. So Shamash, now during this time becomes a pretty important god, and we'll continue to see Shamash in the future. This is Shamash sitting here with, of course, handing the rod and the ring to Hammurabi. A rod and ring we've seen elsewhere, right? The stele of Ur-Nammu. We've seen this in the investiture scene of Zimri-Lim. That rod and ring, again, probably a measuring instrument for apportioning not just temples, but measuring out justice. And the fact that this is used on a law code is very, very telling in that regard. It's also interesting to take a look at the composition here. Hammurabi is in a pose of devotional respect. He's got his hand to his mouth. We've seen that in cylinder seals earlier in these presentation scenes, sort of awed by the presence of the god. But there's an intentional, almost imbalance of power. In this case, Hammurabi is actually taller than the seated god. Whereas all of the other examples we've seen before, these gods are meeting almost as, well, in a lot of ways, equals with their eyes meeting. Now we can see that Hammurabi is depicted as almost being a bit higher than the god Shamash. This scene, which is at once, a presentation scene, but almost in a sense a confrontation scene. And we have every reason to believe that this is intentional. So this combination of confrontation and communication with the gods is again something that plays into establishing Hammurabi as one of these great kings. Artistically, it's important. We see a shift in the way that the gods are depicted. Oops, let me jump back here. If you remember back in the stele of Ur-Nammu, there's this emphasis on a profile, right? This two-dimensional profile, but at the same time, there are problems in rendering things in 3D. So, for example, these horned headdresses, while our god in the Ur-Nammu, or in the stele of Ur-Nammu, is facing forward or facing to the side in profile, his headdress is facing towards us. So there's no question as to the composition that these are a set of horns coming from both sides. This changes. This perspective changes during the time of Hammurabi. You can see the horns of this headdress are now completely in profile as opposed to facing us. A combination of profile and forward facing. And this is important not just because not just because of this shift, but it allows us to actually date things to this period. So the investiture scene of Zimri-Lim, we see the same thing. Full profile horns. And when we find cylinder seals, when we find other art objects dating this period, when the horns are completely in profile, we know that it dates to the Old Assyrian and Old Babylonian perspective. So this is an important transition for dating these objects. Anyway, again, artistically, this is an important piece, And it's a combination of text and image that combines this message that Hammurabi is the defender of the land, provider of the gods, and a judge of his people. Some other pieces that we have dating to the time of Hammurabi. We have the head of a ruler. This was also found in Susa, another piece that was carted off by the Elamites. And we think that this actually might be a portrait of Hammurabi. There's some features that date it. It might be a little bit earlier. It's not quite clear. But the facial features here are quite different than what we've seen, say, during the time of Gudea. Gudea, of course, we saw these features that are idealized. Gudea's large ears, his open eyes, his smooth skin, this idealized portrait of the ruler, his strong arms. In this case, we're seeing something quite different. We see a face that, while damaged, is quite aged. It almost looks careworn and almost like he's tired and sort of worn down by the responsibilities of kingship. You can see here these bags under his eyes, the sort of sunken eyes, maybe from a lack of sleep. And I sort of bring this up. I'm not just sort of making this up. This is something that we see during this period in other places as well. In Egypt during this time, Sesostris III and Amenemhat III, both from the 19th century, contemporaries of Hammurabi, they do the same thing. The kings during this period are depicted in a very realistic sense. You can see the lines of their face, the frowning, the sagging jowls almost. So it's very interesting to compare these two and see these very realistic depictions of kings during this time. Number of other objects we have during this time. Small clay plaques that date to the old Babylonian period. And we have hundreds and hundreds of these from cities in Isin and Larsa. They're made out of molds, so they could be produced over and over and over again. Most are pretty small. They could be held in your hand. We find them in domestic residences, but also in temples. So they appear to be objects of devotion, perhaps brought to temples. However, they exhibit a wide range of motifs. We see mythological scenes, gods killing monsters. In this case, this is the head of Humbaba from the Gilgamesh epic. Remember, the Gilgamesh epic becomes very important because it's retold during this old Babylonian period. Shamash, as a god, figures very prominently in the Gilgamesh epic, specifically because it's retold during this time, with an emphasis on tying Babylon, tying kings like Hammurabi into the narrative. We see scenes of daily life. For example, this mother, this dog giving or nursing her pups. Scenes of individuals playing music. Also scenes of marriage and daily life. Some erotic imagery of people at, for example, at these brothels, drinking beer, having celebrations. So again, focusing on many dimensions of daily life, mythological scenes. They're very, very interesting. This period under Hammurabi, again, with the establishment of law, Hammurabi is able to create this empire through his charisma, through his just sheer force of his personality. As we'll see, after he dies, the empire that he establishes suffers the same fate as Shemshi-Adad. It begins to fall apart, and by 1595, the city is sacked by the Hittites, which we'll talk about next time. But I did want to throw this up here too. Hammurabi, again, is very prominent. We can actually